Okay guys, today we're going to be talking about graphing a quadratic using zeros. Now remember, the zeros are where the quadratic or the function is crossing the x-axis. So whenever you're finding the zeros, you always know that the y value will be 0, and it's where it is crossing the x-axis. So in this case, here's our function. We have x squared minus x minus 6. And here is the equation in standard form. Remember, we're going to have to keep referring back to that. So your first step you want to do here, as usual when you're graphing these by hand, you want to find the axis of symmetry. Now again, in order to do that, you need the following equation. So the axis of symmetry, we have x equals negative b over 2a. So again, referring back to standard form, we can see that our b value occurs right here. So in this case, if we look at our function, our b value will be negative 1. So what we need to do here is plug these numbers in. So when we do this, if we plug in a negative 1 into this negative b, we know that the negatives will simply cancel out. So we don't have to write the negative, it becomes positive. So we have 1 over 2 times our a value, which is 1, so we can just write it as a half. So our axis of symmetry is simply just going to be a half. Now remember, in order to find the y value now of the vertex, we need to take this number and plug it into our function. And that will give us the y value. So we can write it like this. So what will our function be when we plug a half into the x? So let's go ahead and do that. This is squared. So now let's simply do these operations. Well, this exponent needs to go to both the numerator and the denominator. So we have 1 squared, which is going to be just 1. And then we have 2 squared, which is going to be 4. So a quarter. And then minus a half. And then minus 6. Now if these numbers were a little bit more complex, you would have to get a common denominator between all 3 of them. But these numbers are pretty simple, so let's go ahead and just work them. A quarter and a negative a half is just going to make negative a quarter. And then we have minus 6. And a negative a quarter and then a negative 6 is simply going to make negative 6 and 1 quarter, or negative 6.25. Alright? So that is our point of our vertex. So we could simply write it like this. 1/2 negative 6.25. So at this point, we want to go ahead and graph that vertex point. So we're going to go over a half. So I'll say this is 1 right here. So we're going to go half that distance. And we're going down negative 6.25. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We'll say we're right about here. Okay, so there is our point at 1/2 negative 6.25. Now, the next step is to draw in your axis of symmetry. Remember, this is our vertex. So we can simply just draw in a dotted vertical line. And that is going to serve as our axis of symmetry. Remember, we're graphing a quadratic here, which is a parabola. So remember, a parabola looks like something like this, or like this. Remember, this is opening up, this is opening down. And the axis of symmetry is going to serve as our dividing line. When we reflect across that, it will be congruent. All right, so it helps to draw it in. Now, if you look back at our function, we have a c value of negative 6, also known as our constant, and we know that the constant is always going to be where the function crosses the y-intercept. So we can go ahead and draw this point in. We know that it's going to cross at negative 6 on the y. And since everything has to be congruent across the axis of symmetry, we can simply just reflect this. So the distance is a half, so we could go a half this way. And here's our point here. Now the problem states graphing a quadratic using zeros, so what we need to do now is find the zeros of this function. Now in order to find the zeros, we're going to have to factor this. So I'm going to rewrite the function. Right here we have x squared minus x minus 6. Now if you saw my previous videos, I talk about factoring using the AC method. So if you have not seen those, I suggest you go and take a look so you know how to factor the way we're about to do it. So the AC method, we simply just do A times C. In this case, it's going to be 1 times negative 6, so that's a negative 6. And then we say to ourselves, what two numbers when we multiply will be negative 6, but add up to negative 3. Now in this case, it's going to be x minus 3 and x plus 2. So again, what two numbers when I multiply will be negative 6, but add up to negative 1. I think I misspoke. It's supposed to be negative 1. So that is going to be negative 3 and 2. Again, negative 3 times 2 is going to be negative 6. Negative 3 plus 2 is going to be negative 1. Okay, and now at this point, this is all equal to 0. Because remember, we're solving for the zeros. When this function crosses the x-axis, the y value will always be 0, hence why we put a 0 here. And now we're just going to solve each factor separately. So we have x minus 3 equal to 0, and we have x plus 2 equal to 0. Well, when we do this simple operation, x will be 3, and x will be negative 2. So we can go ahead and graph those points. We are going to graph one at negative 2. So on the x, we're going to go 1, 2, sharp point. And then at x equals 3, we have 1, 2, 3. And then we're simply just going to connect these dots, and that is going to be our function. Again, so this is graphing using the zeros. All right, a little bit different, but same concept.